Okay, we're on. Welcome, Chase. Nice to see
Hi,
you. Hi.
it's good to
Um,
see you.
yeah. Welcome everyone. Just a brief introduction to our guest today, who's taken time out. So grateful for it. Chase Strangio is the Deputy Director for Transgender Justice at ACLU and is a nationally recognized expert on transgender rights. Chase, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
um, Typically what I do is I tell folks kind of like the 3-4 things we're going to cover. So you just had a victory at the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that. There is a bill in Idaho that effectively bans transgender athletes from participating in the sport of their choice. And then we'll finish with kind of like what the limitations of the judicial system are. You have such a brilliant analysis as a legal expert on what that is and what we can do who on the outside in some ways. So let's just get started. You ready?
I'm so ready.
Okay, cool. So the Supreme Court case that just kind of closed and the ruling was given last week was the Harris Funeral Home versus EEOC, which is, kind of, I think people might know more colloquially as the Amy Stevens case. I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it was.
Yeah, so actually it was 3 cases that were consolidated together. And the main question that was before the court was, is it lawful under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to fire an employee just for being LGBTQ? And so it involved Amy Stevens, who was a transgender woman who was fired when she came out to her employer as trans. And then 2 gay men who were also fired when, for being gay, in essence. And so the question was a very straightforward legal question. Is that legal or not? And the law that the court was looking at is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And Title VII is the law that was passed in 1964 as part of the civil rights movement. It's part of the deep organizing of Black communities to expand access to legal protections. And one interesting thing about the Civil Rights Act is that it was being debated in Congress, and it prohibits discrimination. Title VII prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, color, national origin, and religion. And white segregationists tried to kill the bill by adding sex to it. And they thought that would be a poison pill. They thought if we add sex, this won't pass because no one wants to have sex protections. They add sex in, almost no debate, and it passes. So the Title VII has protections for sex discrimination that are actually born out of deep racism. And for the last, half century and plus, the courts have been analyzing the applications of this law. Federal law does not explicitly protect LGBTQ people based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and transgender status. And so the way that our communities have been able to secure protections under federal non-discrimination law is through interpretations of the prohibition on sex discrimination. So individuals have gone to court and said, I was fired for being trans, and that's sex discrimination that's prohibited by Title VII. And at first we were unsuccessful in these arguments, and then over the course of the last 20 years, increasingly courts recognize anti-LGBTQ discrimination as inherently a form of sex discrimination. So Amy was fired from her position as a funeral director in Michigan 7 years ago. So just to note how inefficient the court system is. And she, like so many trans people, sort of was struggling with the truth of her existence internally, coming to terms with it herself, comes out to her wife. Her wife is incredible, sticks by her, and she thinks, I'm going to come out to my employer because I've worked here for 6 years. I'm good at my job. and I trust that I am going to be seen as the same person. So she writes this beautiful letter to her employer, sort of explaining the torment of having to live a lie and that she has to come to work as her authentic self. And she's promptly fired. And this is when Obama is president, and the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is responsible for enforcing Title VII, is holding the position on behalf of the United States that Title VII prohibits discrimination against LGBTQ people. And so actually the case is brought by the EEOC against the funeral home for firing Amy. And so we start out in this posture of the power of the federal government is defending trans people. It goes through the court system and litigation is slow. And while it's on appeal at the federal appellate court, the 2016 presidential election happens. And we at the ACLU are like very concerned that the United States will no longer take the position that Title VII prohibits discrimination against LGBTQ people. Quite rightfully concerned. And so what happened was, on appeal, we intervened on Amy's behalf. And so we represented Amy herself in the proceedings. And there were, the other cases were working their way through the lower courts. And in April of 2019, the Supreme Court decided that they would review this question. And that was terrifying because this is a court that is deeply conservative. This was an essential way in which LGBTQ people had secured protections across federal civil rights laws. And so between April 2019 and June 2020, we're in this sort of precarious limbo of trying to defend the line and ensure that we can sustain protections for our communities. And in the midst of all of that, the Trump administration is systematically attacking LGBTQ people, and particularly trans people, by advancing arguments about the meaning of sex under federal law that are deliberately exclusionary.
Right.
Yeah. So that's sort of how we get to the court, and it's terrifying because this court is not our friend. But the arguments are really simple. So just, to like lay it out, Title VII says that, you cannot refuse to hire or fire or otherwise discriminate against any employee because of such individual employee's sex. And it focuses on the individual. And so the arguments we made were, if you fire me, Chase, because I have a male gender identity and was assigned female at birth, you wouldn't fire someone assigned male at birth for having a male gender identity. So it actually doesn't matter how you define sex, because it is but for my sex that you fired me. Even if in your mind you only conceptualize sex in the narrowest sense, you say, fine, your sex is only that which you are designated at birth. That is still the reason I'm fired, because I'm trans.
Because you're trans, because it's still in direct relationship to the sex that you were given at birth.
Yep. So we push forward this very conservative argument, trying to appeal to Justice Gorsuch, who is known to be a textualist, meaning you look at the law, you look at the text of the law. It doesn't matter what Congress intended. It doesn't matter what anyone intended, but do the words apply? And we're like, the words apply. And same for sexual orientation. Like if a man comes into work and a woman comes into work and they both have wives and they only fire the woman for having a wife, it's sex discrimination. They're treating men and women differently.
Right.
And the court bought our arguments. It was like, and we won 6-3. Like, we didn't just get Gorsuch, which was our target, we got the Chief Justice as well. And so, and it was an unequivocal, very clear, precise, no like, you have to show this, you have to show this. Oh, well, if they say this, then it is sex. It's like, nope, it's always sex discrimination. And that was a massive win.
So I think now is the time to kind of like unpack, just stretch this out just a little bit, because I think maybe some folks are like, wait, repeat that to me again. Okay. So I will, because sometimes it takes me a second to just kind of like digest. So what you guys did was basically say, so a woman walks in, a man walks in, they both have wives, right? The woman gets fired because she has a wife, but she is being fired for sex discrimination because she is a woman, because she's a woman who happens to have a wife, right? But she is fired only because of the sex that she was given at birth. Is that what you guys were arguing?
Yeah, basically it was just, the case law has basically said, if it's but for your sex that the bad thing happened, Title VII prohibits it. And we're like, okay, well, you have one man and one woman. Even if you're thinking in the most binary, like biologically constrained notions, it's still sex discrimination. And
Right.
so we were like, you can be your conservative court selves and you still sort of have to rule for us. Like, we still win if you're going to be principled at all. And so this is where,
interesting.
You don't always win. Even if you have a conservative principle, they don't always go for it. They often reverse engineer the outcome. So we still had, so this is where it's like, yes, we had the righteous legal arguments. We were right on the law. We could appeal to a conservative sensibility in legal doctrine, and still, that doesn't necessarily compel the victory. And so that's where also so much of the work was about public discourse around the case and making sure that when the justices were contending with the principles, that they were in their bodies sort of understanding transness and queerness as something that was integrated into their understanding of the world. Because, you can imagine this legal argument was just as strong in 1975, same statute, but we were not going to win the case in 1975.
Right.
So it's like the combination between finding the right legal argument and shifting the cultural and social and political context such that you can get enough votes to win, even if the outcome scares a conservative court.
Right. And also gives them, I was talking with a friend who is a part of a foreign mission here in the United States, and she was saying, one of the things that is, she's a diplomat, but one of the tools that's used in diplomacy is also to allow the other countries to agree to something, because you've given them also the ability to not sway from their similarly conservative ideals. So you've explained to them, you've presented the legal argument, but you've also, and in this particular case, she was talking about diplomacy. So she was talking about, you also have to offer in diplomacy the opportunity for the other country or the other head of state to save face, so that they can then, you're basically giving them the one, in Supreme Court cases, it would be kind of like the ruling, but it's like you're giving them the ability to rule in your favor while also understanding how it is not completely distancing themselves from their own professional, or in this case, kind of national mission that they get from their particular country. So it sounds like you guys employed the same strategy, which was, we're going to engage a very, you use the word that's super interesting, conservative argument, right? So it's not, it allows for everyone to have kind of like their unfortunate personal opinions about what it means to be trans or what it means to be gay, without that necessarily informing the decision that's made around the consequences of what it means to be fired when you are trans or when you are gay. That's beautiful.
Yeah, no, and it's, it's like there's always this give and take, and so you're like, you have to contend with, well, what are the lines we're willing, to cross? What are the lines we're not willing to cross? And how do you balance sort of the recognition of the inherently constrained nature of legal conversation and theater, which is what it is. It's like we are sort of playing with power and words, and then we have to then account for the consequences of that. So it's recognizing the harm reduction imperative in it, right? Like, we need to hold the line.
Right.
So what does it take? And sometimes it takes giving people you don't agree with something to hold on to, while doing sort of other labor in other contexts to make sure that you're building more robust visions of justice, that you're leveraging the moment to tell full, complete stories of queer and trans lives. And ultimately, I think, by being sort of thoughtful and accountable to both like our internal sense of principle and messiness in the work, that we can be more authentic and more persuasive. I think there's this sense of like, oh, you can't show up as your full self because that will freak people out. And sure, like, I didn't like dress like this in court, but
it's good.
But I mean, yeah, like I did wear nail polish to my deposition yesterday. But it's like, there is a way where sort of sitting in the truth of one's existence in front of others can be like the right amount of destabilizing. And so I think there was something here too, where the day of the argument, there were so many trans people in the courtroom. That has definitely never happened before, and so that part of what that meant was showing the justices that it was already happening. It already happened. The change they feared was over. So that, there wasn't going to be some, like, as Gorsuch said at argument, well, won't there be some massive social upheaval? Well, no. Look,
it's happened. Right. We're in the future already.
Yeah, yes.
The future
exactly.
has happened.
It's happened. So you can go do all your evil things because you're going to do them. But, this thing you're fearing, you can't stop it because we exist and we're going and we're working. And so that's sort of part of, I think, what happened. And I do think like the sort of like, I was sitting there in the court on the day of argument, just feeling all our ancestors and was just thinking like, we were never meant to be in this space. No. And yet we are. And so what, and that I think is really powerful.
I love that. So that's at the federal level.
Yeah.
We're going to zoom in. I mean, I want to use expletives, but I won't. We're going to Idaho.
Yes.
Okay. So Idaho has passed this bill, HB 500. It's a House bill that effectively bans all transgender athletes from participating in their sport, in their gender. So I guess, so we talked about Title VII. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about Title IX, which is the one that has been used the most in reference to cases like this.
Yeah, so I think so. Title IX is Title IX of the amendments to the Civil Rights Act of 1972, and it prohibits sex discrimination in federally funded educational institutions, which is basically all of them. The one thing about the ruling that at the Supreme Court that I want to sort of make clear is that it applies across the board. So one of the transformative things about it is that it's not just about employment, because there's sex protections in the context of education, which is Title IX, in the context of housing and shelter under the Fair Housing Act, and in credit, and then in healthcare, because the Affordable Care Act also has non-discrimination protections based on sex. So this deeply upset the agenda of the Trump administration and many states to entrench in law an exclusionary understanding of sex protections. And this has been the agenda, like the key focus of anti-LGBT and groups in the religious right for the last 5 years after marriage equality. It was a shift to, let's cut trans people out of every sector of life if possible. So the decision is going to have, far-reaching positive impacts. There are limitations too, and we'll talk about that later. Yeah. But so when it comes to the strategy in the states, states have been pushing different ways to target trans people very aggressively since 2016. In 2016, we saw the proliferation of the anti-trans bathroom bill. That was the manifestation then. HB2 passes in North Carolina. You have over 50 bills targeting transgender individuals, mostly transgender youth in schools, pushing, you know, trying to sort of codify an understanding of sex that essentially is, you know, any sex-separated space should be defined based on assigned sex at birth, what they will call biological sex, but that, you know,
it's not
biological sex never
biological
has
sex is actually so complicated and complex and nuanced and very exciting. Like,
yeah, and they like don't actually, and literally if you ask them what it is, they just change their definition. They're like, it's this. Oh wait, if you meet that, then it's not that. You know, it's like, you can see, it's an ideological concept that is deployed for purposes of hurting others. It's not a fixed thing. They're like, oh, this is a clear thing. Like God made two biological sexes. But then you're like, well, what are they? How do you define them? And then it like slowly devolves. So 2016, you start to see these bills. HB2 passes in North Carolina. That's the big sort of turning point in the bathroom conversation. We sue, by the way, because that's what we do. And then over the course of the next few years, the anti-trans groups and forces, even though they had quite a bit of traction initially with the bathroom discourse, it really starts to become ineffective. They start to lose these fights in court. They stop being able to pass bills at the legislature. They have multiple ballot initiatives, so efforts to have voters vote in, you know, sort of when they go to vote on initiatives to exclude trans people from restrooms, all of it fails. So by 2018, this strategy is like, it's basically gone. And they admit as much, you know, sort of, they sort of, a bunch of groups after a loss in Massachusetts said, you know, we made up the bathroom predator thing. Like, we know there's no safety risk to letting trans people use the bathroom. And so, but, you know, ever well-funded and agile, our opponents, you know, shifted pretty quickly to targeting sports.
Right.
And the reason why they shifted to sports is because there's a long history of regulating the body in sport. And the sort of the sexed body as a site of contested, you know, sort of understanding and regulation is deep in sport, especially with, you know, it has a deeply white supremacist history. There's a long history of sex, you know, verification at the international level, targeting particularly women from the global South.
Totally. Right. So Caster Semenya is a perfect example of this. But also when I was at the Olympics in 1996, I was, what did they call, not anonymously, what's luck of the draw? The word is escaping me.
Oh, yeah. Randomly.
Yeah. I was randomly chosen to get the swab, right?
For your chromosomes.
For my chromosomes, right? And so they, you know, so I walk in and it's like every other like non-gender conforming fucking athlete in there with me. And I wasn't out at the time, so I didn't really kind of like register what was going on. But, you know, they basically, you know, this is in 1996, so this is, you know, 24 years ago, but they basically kind of like every federation kind of sent forth everyone that was possibly, potentially, maybe not the gender that they thought they were, right? I was, you know, assigned sex, you know, female sex at identity at birth. And, you know, as far as I was concerned, I was just not like the others, but I didn't really understand why. And so they, you know, they swab and, you know, the tests, you know, were rudimentary at that point and have since, you know, I would probably fail the test now. But at the time I passed and I'm allowed to participate. But, you know, the kind of like at the international level, and this is something we can talk about as we discuss this, is that, you know, a lot of times one of the things that I'm always so interested about is that the, you know, anti-trans sentiment that is, you know, ideology that is putting forth sport and the argument of sport is using elite athletes as the example, and yet elite athletes are I keep wanting to say to people like, yo, you're not that good. Like it's never like it's
Yeah.
most of these sports can actually be played in a co-ed way with like even more excitement happening, right? Like because there are a lot of women basketball players that the men would be so lucky to have. Like I'm like, so, but at the elite level, I feel like any sort of like distinction around sex and gender has been so deeply policed in ways that, you know, live outside of this conversation around being trans, in terms of like what is done to a woman's body in order to maintain these feelings of femininity. You know, one of the things that I talked about in the article that I wrote about Castor is that they're not policing. That's not what they're fucking policing. They're policing the fact that she is masculine presenting, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, so let's, you know, so come back to Idaho.
Yeah. So this is now, they're importing this long history of sex regulation into sort of the K through 12 and collegiate context through these new bills that are targeting trans student athletes. And in 2020, there's about 18 of these bills introduced across the country. And the only one that passes is HB 500 in Idaho. The only reason it's the only one that passes is because of COVID. COVID shuts down a lot of legislative sessions, which, you know, is generally speaking not a good thing. For these purposes is a good thing, because states were doing horrific anti-trans things like right in March when things started to slow down. Idaho just plowed forward and they passed 2 anti-trans laws. One was HB 500, which bars trans. I mean, it actually just implements a sex testing paradigm that bars all trans people and subjects all women, potentially women and girls, to intrusive sex verification if their sex is challenged by anyone, which, you know, that obviously is a disaster. They also simultaneously pass a bill that bars trans people from updating their birth certificates, which again is just sort of part of this regime of saying we, state, are going to control sort of who gets to be in one category and who gets to be in the other.
Right.
And I think the challenge in sports is that our opponents have been very successful at peeling off our allies. And there's this idea that trans people and non-trans women with high levels of testosterone are a threat to cisgender women. Right. And that the threat is not the sort of safety threat. The safety threat comes in sometimes in terms of in some context, sport context, but unlike in the restroom context where there was like the amorphous predator, here it's not quote unquote fair to let trans girls compete with cis girls. And that's the discourse. And all of these laws are called something along the lines of protect women's sports, which is really difficult to stomach when they're being pushed by lawmakers who actually hate women. Right. And that's what's so troubling about, you know, like sort of self-proclaimed feminists jumping into this fight, because I'm like, look who you're partnering with. Like, they don't care about sports. If they cared about women's sports, they would invest in women's sports programs, equal pay, you know, women's coaching, leadership development of women's athletes, like proper training for women and girl athletes. Like, I grew up, I was a girl soccer player, and like I had 3 knee surgeries in high school because we were not equipped like to support our bodies in sport, even though it was a central part of our lives. So no one cares about that, you know, but yet we're like promoting this discourse of protecting women and girls. But really what it is about controlling bodies and policing and expelling trans people and entrenching in law anti-trans norms. So Idaho passes HB 500. The governor signs it on March 30th. We sued on April 15th, challenging the law, you know, on the ground that it violated the Constitution because it treats people unequally, and that it violated Title IX, the law prohibiting sex discrimination in education, as well as some privacy-related claims because of the way in which it would impose upon the body of athletes participating in women and girls sports. And we have 1 transgender plaintiff and 1 cisgender plaintiff. So 2 women saying, you know, this is, you know, unconstitutional and violative of Title IX. And the challenge really is that people have a very reflexive sense that boys are better, stronger, faster than girls, that it is physiological, biological, and unchangeable, and that trans women are really men.
Right.
And those normative assumptions about how the world works are so dangerous and so deep. And that's sort of what we're contending with in this litigation. And I think it's easy for people to say, well, it's just sports, and is that the most pressing issue right now? And it's not just sports. I mean, so first of all, participation in sports is incredibly important for many people. So taking away that access for young people is deeply damaging. It also is deeply damaging to tell a group of people that they're unfit to participate in the activities that their peers are. So there's
and I think here it's like not just any group of people. It's an already marginalized with higher rates of suicide, higher rates of being on the receiving end of harassment and bullying, higher rates of murder. Like we are talking serious risk. This is an at-risk group that if they even get to a point where they are participating in a sport that offers self-esteem, communication with your peers, physical health, mental health, they are now that at-risk group who has had to overcome so much adversity to even decide that they're going to go and play a sport in their gender. They're now being told, no, go back, don't get any of the benefits, because what we're talking about here are mostly children, right? Like we're not talking about elite athletes. We're talking about young children. We're talking about kiddie baseball, kiddie soccer, kiddie swimming, tadpoles. Like that is what we are talking about. And I think that I just want to go back to one of the things you said around this privacy, is that what this law actually allows is anyone who has any doubts, whatever, without any sort of justification, right, can say, I think that person is man, woman, not participating in the correct, what's in this case, this law, which I find interesting, is only for women.
Yeah.
Right?
Only women. Yeah.
Only women. So it is truly, disturbing that women would understand that this law is somehow, it's a crumb on a table that is distracting from all of the other things that you have said, which are, equal pay, equal training facilities, none of which women have, by the way, right? In like the US soccer women's team is a perfect example. Here we are a year later, they have won the World Cup. They have, brought Megan Rapinoe, athlete of the year across so many things, have brought millions and millions of dollars into the economy. And we're like, train on like concrete, like it's cool. They would never ask that of a much less performing men's team, right? So I wonder what happens. So I have two questions for you. So what happens now? And, the next question brings me to kind of like the bigger, the last part of our conversation around kind of like so you are doing, and the ACLU is doing their work within the court system. But while that happens, and telling us what is going to happen now, what happens for you legally with ACLU once this thing happens. But what can we do to, you talk about, you said something about kind of like shifting the cultural context or the theater of the court, or this very profound visual that you gave of the Supreme Court full of trans people. What is it that we can do who are on the outside, who in some cases are former professional athletes? Like, and I look at this and I look at, the woman who is the one who brought this to the floor, and I look at her athletic history, and I'm like, this is, none of us agree with this. So many of us as athletes signed, 450 of us signed this petition saying deplorable. And all of us were elite athletes and we're kind of like, let the kids play. Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? So I think there's, you know, so those are my two questions for you. Like, what happens next for you in Idaho? And then also, what is it that we can, what is the larger kind of like limitations of the judicial system, and how does that work in our kind of day-to-day life?
Yeah, no. So you know, in Idaho, what's happening is, you know, so many things, because the case is sort of, when there's a big case like this and it's the first time a law like this has passed, it's sort of so much attention, and it's the first time we're presenting this type of case to a court in the United States. So we have what's called a preliminary injunction, which is trying to stop the law from going into effect while the longer trajectory of the case is pending. So we're sort of asking the court for quicker relief. And so we sued a bunch of people, a bunch of government officials, and the hearing on our sort of ask to stop the law will be on July 22nd. Now, Alliance Defending Freedom, which is an anti-LGBT hate group,
Right.
is trying to intervene as well in the lawsuit to defend the law. The state is defending the law. We have a bunch of experts weighing in about the law. So there's tons of arguments being made on all the sides. And we'll have the hearing on July 22nd. Then the court will decide sort of whether, you know, we have a claim, whether we don't, whether the law is going to go into effect, whether it's not. You know, I think that a lot of the sort of urgency that we're presenting is based on, you know, fall season is starting. There are some sort of factual contingencies about whether there are going to be fall sports in anywhere in the United States. So I think there may be some delays just with the realities of what life is like right now. But one of the really insidious things that's happening in this case, and happens in a lot of trans cases when you have parties like Alliance Defending Freedom is not only are they arguing that the cisgender girls and women have a right to exclude trans people. So they're claiming an affirmative right that is infringed by a trans person being in proximity to them, essentially, which that's really dangerous. If that argument prevails, then not only that's sort of the flip side of asking, are we protected? Because then what they want is to prohibit us from being protected, which would undermine all state and local protections that we have. And they're also seeking constitutional protections to exclude transness. So if you know, we continue on this trajectory of a very conservative court system, and that court system would locate a constitutional right not to be in proximity to a trans person, that would be a sort of deeply disturbing way in which the law could progress, and that we're fighting against. The other thing is that ADF is arguing, which is just so deep, and they did this in Amy Stevens' case, because ADF was also counsel for Amy's employer. They argue that our client, who's trans, is not harmed by the law because it is in her best interest to participate in the men's sports, because being trans is inherently deviant and dangerous and sets someone up on a path for poor mental health outcomes, and that the best way to deal with that is to force people into their assigned sex at birth. So they're actually arguing that the discrimination is in our best interest in court, sort of like conversion therapy model of legal advocacy. It's like, yeah, we want people not to be trans, so actually she's not harmed, she's helped by this. And it's so deep and so dark, and so gross. So we're fighting back against sort of all of these threads. And the outcome, you know, will, you know, sort of not just be, is the law, you know, constitutional or not, or illegal under Title IX or not. It's going to answer or raise more questions about sort of what is the state of permissible legal discourse around transness. Like, where are we headed? Because it will inevitably go up on appeal. There's other cases, you know, in Connecticut that were also counsel on behalf of 2 Black trans girls who have been running as girls for the duration of their high school experiences, or for, for one of them for part of it, for the other all of it. And cis girls have sued to block them from running and to take away records of their past wins. So these questions are going to be percolating in the courts. And, sort of to your second question, what is the limitation of the judiciary, and where else do we need to step in? We cannot win this in the courts alone. I mean, there's just no way. We can't win anything in the courts alone, because the judicial system itself is just a system that is designed to maintain power. It's a system that was created through our Constitution at a time when defending chattel slavery was integral to the national structure of the United States, and the legacy of that is completely inherent to the law. So we have to recognize that this is the system that we're dealing with. It adapts to serve power, and what we can do as lawyers is intervene to disrupt so that there's more space for people to do real transformative work. And when it comes to these conversations that are playing out in the courts now about the regulation of trans bodies and all bodies, this is a conversation that is inextricable from the questions around why are Black trans women being murdered? And how do we disrupt systems of both state violence on Black and brown bodies, particularly trans bodies, because the conversation that comes up is trans people aren't real.
Right.
That there is something about a trans body that betrays a fraud of transness. That is the very message that people internalize that then causes them to exert violence on trans people.
Right.
The street-based violence, state-based violence. And so we need to keep trans people alive, and keeping trans people alive has a lot of different components. Yes, there's like a legal component. There's also just a redistributive component, making sure people have access to food, shelter, connection, safe rides home, safe treatment for, non-gender related things, because so many trans people go into healthcare settings and face horrific discrimination and then end up
are unable to actually access the care that they need, because the conversation becomes one about the fact that they're trans, not about whatever it is.
Yes.
And not everyone is in a urban setting like New York City, where you can go to the center and they're, everyone there is trans, and you're just like, it's a surprise if you're not, right? You know what I mean?
Right. It's like, I'm never leaving New York, because I'm like, I need to be able to go to the gynecologist and not have them be like, what the fuck are you?
So, I didn't go for 15 years. And that's fine, on the record. Like, it's like, it's like, because I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to be the only dude in that office.
Exactly. And just sitting there and everyone's staring at you, and then they call you in and you're just like, oh, this is a nightmare. And so, but so like, this is the world that we have to inhabit. Like, our bodies exist. And so sort of knowing that the conversation is really about sort of challenging our fundamental expectations of how bodies have to be and how we sex them into binary categories. I feel so invested in this, because unless and until we sort of accept that like a man can have a vagina, and this is just like the most basic, like, and a woman can have a penis, and that we can't take physiological signifiers as the only and defining thing by which we sort people into binary categories of male and female, we're gonna keep seeing systematic and individually perpetrated violence. And I think I
think that approach is just genuinely like an insult to human intelligence, because everything else tells us that that is not true, that it's actually one of the most flawed signifiers of anything that has to do with biological sex. And that there are a lot of animals that are like, I'm going to switch today. It's like there's and the other thing that it makes me think of is that, this feels there's so many things that this makes me think of, but for the purposes of this conversation, there is this kind of like very real, kind of like undue burden for trans people to keep kind of asserting themselves as real, like that we're not some sort of an anomaly or an exception, or that we're not who we say we are, that there's somehow some sort of like reversion that we can go back to, that there is, you know, this like kind of the realness of the trans body as something that is constantly up for debate, conversation. And I also just want to put in that it's like, you know, there's been a lot of talk around this, but it's like you and I are both trans bodies having this really complicated discussion that is intellectual and kind of like very heady in some ways, but we're actually talking about our bodies. And I want people who are listening to this to understand that the people that they're listening to are two trans people who are experts in each their own field, doing their work, who happen to be kind of like exerting the labor of, again, saying like, yes, this is the work that is happening, this is the work that is doing, but I just want, in an effort to kind of like connect back to the realness of the trans body, you are listening to two trans people.
Yeah. Yeah, like so trans.
Like, so trans. Like, it's like, so I think that, you know, to kind of like bring it back to, you know, something that's even less, that to outside of the esoteric, which is one of the things that you have indicated is this kind of very nebulous space where all of these opinions and ideas get to happen without, you know, and of course, this is something that we've all heard kind of growing up queers. It's like, you know, there would be these like deeply homophobic people, and then they would be asked about, you know, their two lesbian neighbors who live together, and they'd be like, oh yeah, but I love them. They're great. Right. So it's, you know, I think that, to your point, and then I want to hear more about what we can do, but there is this very real, it just felt important to acknowledge that. But I think that, there is this real question around kind of like, what are we actually trying to police here? And what we're trying to, in this case, I really do believe, police is the female body and what it looks like, what it can be, what it's allowed to be, wherever it started from, you know? And that is something that I think, like, you know, that's,
yeah, I mean, that's what it is. And it's a deeply like white supremacist project. Like if you look at who else is policed out of the category, Black women, you know, like Michelle Obama was constantly in the public discourse, called a man, called a trans, Serena Williams, you know, power, you know, so who gets to occupy the sphere of the woman and who gets to decide? And of course, as such, then who, like, what is appropriate manness and where do people fit in the middle? And so like all of, you know, it's the sort of, it's like it's a project that is about sort of controlling individual bodies, but it's also about building state power. It's about, you know, pulling people out of the ability to claim their existence freely and autonomously, which has been part of our country since the beginning, you know, control over Indigenous people, control over Black slaves, you know, this is how we started. And that's really also what's going on here. And so then coming back to sort of the sort of granular, what can people do? I mean, I also think people should check themselves. Like as a parent, I always bring this up, but it's like, you cannot have a conversation about children without people being like, oh, do boy or a girl? You know, and I can't even conceptualize, oh, you're pregnant, boy or a girl. It's like, but if we stop ourselves and the impulse to sort in this particular way, that actually will have quite a few like transformative consequences, even if we make sort of micro changes in our lives. You know, and you can see like, you know, in schools, like stop having kids line up as boys and girls. Stop unnecessarily sorting in this way. We would not accept segregation in other contexts the way we do in the context of sex. And we need to ask ourselves why. You know, we wouldn't say, oh, like Muslims go to this bathroom and Jews go to this bathroom. You know, and so yes, we have internalized a sense that sex is different and that there are reasons why we need to separate in this way, but we have to interrogate why. And so I think that's too part of sort of cultural projects need to shift the norms, because if you asked so, you know, having been litigating same-sex marriage equality cases for a long time, we used to lose those cases all the time. You know, it was like we were losing the cases until we were winning the cases, but nothing changed except people started changing what they understood about same-sex couples. And if you ask people now, oh, did you support marriage equality in 2012? They'll be like, oh yeah, I always have, when they fully have not.
They did not.
They've changed their own history because it feels so normalized in their mind. And you could even see that with trans people in bathrooms. Like that was like, so many people are like, oh, I don't know, like, but you know, now it's like people are like, well, maybe that's not such a big deal. Now I'm on to sports, you know, and so it's like the law's not changing. You know, what's changing is how we talk about and contend with and see people as human or not.
And so what helps that? Like, if you could pick, like, here are the 5 things that we need to, that need to be kind of like, if you had like your, you know, like your cultural bullet points that could happen in tandem to this particular court case.
So yeah, I mean, so for this case, I mean, I think number one, like, and it is having sort of cis women naming that it harms women. Like, it isn't like not in our name. Like that, we need more people when women and girls who are trans are attacked, we need more cis allies saying this isn't helping us. And I know it's not. And in this, and so one perfect example is the same, the discourse and the quote unquote research that is being used in the anti-trans legislative fights was cited by US Soccer in their case to argue for less pay for the women's national team. So it's the same norms that are saying trans people aren't real women that are also being exported to say, you know, cis women shouldn't get paid equally because they're not as good.
Which, you know, is not surprising given the purpose of this judicial system, which was created to keep power in power. And the power in power that we're talking about is a white supremacist patriarchy, right? So any deviation or difference outside of that.
Right back.
And so what's wonderful is it's like, you know, in many ways, all of us kind of like cross that line in each of our professions around like, okay, well, where am I going to go have this conversation, even though it is within the system that is built, that is oppressive, which is, you know, to your point of like, nothing changes in the courts. So we're clear, the courts were created to keep power in power, right? Yep. And so it also makes me think of, you know, the challenge, the difficulty of talking about, or the difficulty in talking about trans bodies is that we then have to bring kind of like the big elephant into the room and just be like, so we're clear. The thing that is trying to stay in power right now is white supremacy patriarchy. Like that's actually what is, so we can either start talking about that and all of the different ways in which it manifests intersectionally, or we can try to pretend like this is about trans people in sports.
Yeah. Right.
And I think, so that's,
Yeah. So I think it's like, we have to have the bigger conversation. And I think, so that's like one thing. And I think leadership by cis women is critical. Like, create the conversation, start it, say, this isn't, no, I will not accept this in my name. I think that's really important. I think sort of investing in trans projects. So like, we want more trans created art. Like, we need the trans lens, like the photographic lens, the visual lens, because trans bodies are othered in every single way. So every time I'm photographed by a cis person, it feels like the image is created by a cis person. Right. That doesn't mean a cis person can never take a trans person's photo. It means we have to invest in trans art and create, you know, creative projects, particularly by, you know, Black trans people and other trans people of color. We you know, that is a critical part of shifting the conversation, because trans people are so often talked about, and we need to be able to speak for ourselves.
Right.
And that's
going to put a plug in here for disclosure. Everyone should watch it.
Yes.
It's a documentary on Netflix that does just that. And that actually, you know, Jen says something really interesting in the documentary itself. She said, look, the problem isn't that people are talking about it the wrong way. It is the only conversation that's happening. And so all of us need to be talking about it more, so that when there is the occasional clumsy representation of a trans person, it is not the only representation of a trans person. And I was like, oh, Jen, yes.
Yeah.
But it's so, you know, a plug there for disclosure that does just that, you know, begins to talk about the historical, particularly here kind of focused in on film and the silver screen, but I think that we can do that in so many other areas as well.
Yes, completely. And I think that, so we really have to. I think that we need to start to sort of reconceptualize our political demands, just generally speaking. You know, like it's like, you know, it's not enough to sort of, in our engagement with political systems, sort of seek, you know, representation of different groups. It's not enough to seek equality. What we really need to see are demands for justice-oriented goals. And what I mean by that is we need to make sure that we are undoing the root systems that are causing harm. And that means like shifting conversations about violence. That means shifting conversations about wealth distribution. And that feels essential because so many people in our communities are dying, particularly Black trans women, because of, you know, sort of limited demands for change. You know, we sort of go back to the carceral system. We're like, oh, let's put more people in jail. Let's invest more in policing. When what we really need to do is say, well, how can we hold space for people to build together? How can we sort of say, okay, yes, we want a trans person in Congress, and that's not going to be the end of the story. And so I think, like, whether that's a cultural project or a political project, or whether there's even a difference between those things, I think we need to sort of be more creative, imaginative, and bold with our vision.
Well, I think the other thing that you're talking about too is just kind of like being more bold and speaking the truth, which is winning a Supreme Court case is wonderful. It is not the end. It doesn't necessarily change the life of our Black brothers and sisters in South Florida, right? Like it sure, you know, does something legally, but that person actually doesn't have a job. That person has already been excluded from society. That person has already, you know, ticked all of the boxes that make us such a kind of fragile group to begin with. And so I think that, you know, what it makes me think of is, again, kind of like being more bold about the realities of what it is to be trans, and talk about kind of like, what would it be? You know, I did this project, and one of the things that was amazing in the project is that, you know, it was amazing to gather all of these people together who are, some of them are trans, some of them are butch, some of them were queer, some of them were lesbian identified, but it was like, it took so much to just get that group of people in the room who were so exceptional, that had arrived to where they were despite everything, because they are masculine presenting and identifying in some way. It was astounding. And I just kept thinking, it's like, what would it be like for people to just be who they are and like get on with the business of making art, telling stories, writing, being, you know, kind of like their fierce selves in the way that we contribute, being doctors, being scientists, being astronauts, like being politicians. Like but we're so busy just trying to like say that we're here, that we're not some sort of like, I love it when people call me a unicorn, but I'm like, unicorns aren't real.
Yeah, right.
Like they're beautiful and they're magical, and I am a unicorn, but I'm fucking real.
Yeah.
You know? And so are you. And it's like, so I love this idea of like being more bold about our demands, in a way, is also being more bold about telling the stories of like what is actually happening here.
Yeah. And I think too, like related to all of these things, is just for people to step aside. Like if you enter a space and there's no trans people, no one's talking about it, and you're given a lot of power, say, you know what, I already have a lot of power. I'm gonna just like, I know this like really brilliant trans creative that I'm gonna bring in, and maybe they need a little mentorship and I'm gonna invest in that. I mean, I think we do not have systems of sort of investment in others, leadership development. We need to systematize that, because there are huge gaps in the sort of the representation of trans people in different spaces because of exactly what you said. It's like people are too busy surviving and dealing with so much that, that people, inherently distrust them, think people are unstable, which is deeply ableist and, fucked up. And, all of these ways in which we need people who do have a lot of space in their worlds to bring people in, right. Show up. And that is hugely transformative.
And I think the thing is like, for those of us in the queer community who up until very recently just like began to start getting like crumbs off the table, it's like, we know how, we come from the lineage of taking care of the children, right? Like we come from the lineage of making sure that those who came up behind us are taken care of, because they literally didn't have anyone else to take care of them besides the elders within the community. And I think that, Siri, my wife, and I wrote this article against gay marriage before we got married, and now we're married, because I think everyone should have the right to get married if they want, and also be very complex in their reasoning around it. But anyway, but when we wrote it, the argument still stands, is that there was this privileging of romantic relationships above all the other relationships that us within the queer community had developed because out of necessity, right? That had to do with people who were not, related by blood or by law in any way, but had, become life partners, become carers, become parents, because there was, no one else there. There was no infrastructure in place for us to do it. And I think that one of the things that I hear when you say that is this idea that, like, as queers here in America, we can lean into our history a little bit more around how we take care of each other. And I have definitely experienced the pushback when I have tried to bring someone else into a project, because they, and this is complicated, right? Because they want me, right? And so it's like, I've had to go through, put a lot of words, like it's not going to be what you're suggesting, actually, because the power institutions are the power institutions. They're like, no, well, we'll have you visit, but we're not really interested in A, doing things differently, or B, having you be here for any sort amount of time. Like, nice that you visit, have some tea, but now you can go. And so what you're suggesting is actually doing something that is antithetical to the hierarchical system that many of our industries are built on, right? Also here, it's like this idea of like terminal uniqueness, or of the, manifest destiny individual. There's only you.
Yeah.
There's only you. You are the only one, right? Yeah. And it's like, well, actually, I come from a place where there are lots of people who look just like me. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it was one of the things that you and I delighted in when we first got on this together. We were like, oh, my person. Yeah. Like, cool, right? And I think that, it is so important and so necessary. And also, like, for those of us who have access to places, to be prepared for us to have major pushback, even from people who love us and consider themselves allies and are like, yes, yes, yes to everything that is trans. Ooh, but if you want like more than one of you in the room, like, I don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and that, we need to push back on the notions of like, who is the legible trans? Like, that, like the power, like, so am I legible because I'm, a white lawyer, and then you're just going to let me in? And then, well, there's an obligation on me once I'm let in to be more disruptive, because I am distinctly aware that part of why I'm being let in is because of my proximity to power and other, and so we need to be doing that work as individuals. But again, it's not just, the burden isn't on the individual. The burden is especially not on the individual trans person. And so it's sort of like, it's a combination of holding accountability as one becomes a legible entity in a system of power, to then not lose sight of disrupting that system of power altogether. And that can't be done without the people in leadership also playing a role. And so, you know, it's like people who are sort of know they have lots of power in institutions, then they have so much that they can do. And again, it's like being bold about naming the truth, actually listening and being patient. You know, change is inefficient and capitalism loves efficiency. But we have to be willing to sit in a slower, messier pace if we're gonna see any meaningful change. And so that's the other thing. It's just, you know, it's hard. It's really hard for me. I'm like a fast-paced East Coast person. I'm like, let's get it done. Let's go.
You've chosen like the slowest profession.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. Yes. But you talk really fast in my profession, so that works for me. Or you don't. I mean, you can. And so, but it's like we need to sort of, I think, as people who are storytellers of any kind, people like who are in the business, or sort of committed to creating, like we need to think about our creative projects in expansive ways and sort of outside the demands of efficiency and legible production so that we can give more space for change, which means, yes, maybe I am going to say, you know what, it's going to take me 10 years to meaningfully support like some more trans leaders. Like I can't do it quickly because I don't have the capacity. I can't do it quickly because it's not a quick process. And I have to hold a longer timeline, and I have to hold a timeline that allows for slowing down because of trauma, because of violence, because of all of the ways in which our bodies and our spirits are impacted by sort of these systems that are designed to kill some people and not others. And so I think that's the final sort of thing that people should be thinking about is, you know, what does it look like to sort of have a more messy, slow vision for how this is going to move forward. It doesn't work in law at all. I mean, law is slow, but law is not messy. Law, rules, boxes, you know, make yourself into the box or you're out. And like, that's not going to work. So I think sort of being in exchange and conversation and sort of building over time.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, same, right? You know, it's just.
Yeah. Chase, thank you so much. For your time. Yeah, for your time, for your mind, for your resilience, for your heart. Yeah, and I'm so grateful that you have chosen the profession that you've chosen, because we're so lucky to have you in there, but also what I always take such joy in, Chase and I have known each other for a while now, but what I've always taken such joy in is your ability to translate these really complex ideas and help all of us understand how they affect, and how we can actually do something about it while you do your work, you know? That's very cool.
Thank you for being a partner in the projects, and just, you know, I think it always, there is no way to do it without connection. And so like, we just keep connecting and, you know, learning. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Chase. I'm going to turn this off and then we'll say goodbye.
Okay.